Get around the campfire, kids. We're going to talk about my new book. Ooh, this goes like full creepy vibe. Okay. Hi. I never recorded this for Face to Face with the Reaper. So I'm doing both. Back to back. They're going to cut up 2 videos. So, seeing this one, go watch the other one. Because if you don't, I'll find you. I'll find you. Anyways, so I publish a book a season. My name's NARCISSIA NETAL, formerly Andy Galupa. Call me by that. I throat punch you. Anyways, so Face to Face with the Reaper. That was the spring book I released. One of the spring books. It was released in February. Had free writer's promo, and I kind of fucked up the bag with Face to Face with God. I'm trying. So, some cool stuff about Face to Face with the Reaper from a content side. It's a very shorter novella, just like Face to Face with God. They're shorter, about 100 or so pages, altogether 200 pages, because each chapter has a illustration. Each chapter is 10 pages long. Well, that's not 8, but we're going to pretend it is 8 chapters. And they both have albums with CDs. And I mean full-on musical retelling, 1 to 10% of the story, depending on the chapter that was made into song. So, like, the first chapter of the first book, Face to Face with the Reaper, is turned right. The first song is turned right. And so on and so forth. It's like following along, except for the album's technically free if you go on streaming services, but I hate you if you do, and you should buy it, because support your fucking musicians. Support it. Swear to God. Because who else can do the funny screams? Anyways, so, in general, Face to Face with the Reaper is a psychological thriller, I would call it. The main theme of these 2 books kind of depends, because Face to Face with the Reaper is more focusing on a psychology side of things. I know, that's weird. I don't usually go out of that realm. We'll talk about it in a second. We'll talk about that in the second video, I suppose. So, Face to Face with the Reaper talks more about addiction, grief, and tragedy. So, a couple of things. One thing I will say in there is that our main character is going through grief. Even before this, he technically was, but he's going through grief, and it's a loss of himself. Tim Shultz. There is a writer up here in Lockport called Jim Shultz. I basically stole his name without knowing it. But hey, if Jim's watching this, it's Tim. Anyways, so, Face to Face with the Reaper focuses on the psychology side of things. It focuses on addiction, grief, and tragedy. And where I start with this is actually with an alcoholic. Tim Shultz being that alcoholic. And he drinks and drives. Now, you have to understand, which this is revealed in the chapter context, I believe. He had lost his wife. Not wife. They weren't married, but consider it wife. They weren't, like, officially married. It was just kind of like, hey, we love each other. Whatever did the whole eternity thing, that kind of sucks. So, they did that. 50% of marriages end in divorce. Anyways, and apparently sometimes end in death. Anyways, so, they didn't get married technically, but consider them husband and wife. That's how close they were. No ring, but the meaning and attachment was still there. Tim loses Sancti. That is his wife. Sancti had lymphoma, I believe. I think I chose, like, one form of cancer, but I remembered it as cancer. Fucking all that stuff. But it was cancer, basically. That's not something I thought I would say. She had cancer, and she ends up dying. It was, as we usually do from that, and he divulges himself into drinking. So the major thing to understand about this is not only did he lose his wife, he kind of lost himself. As he explains, I think in the second or first book, towards the end of the first book, or maybe middle of the second book, he basically lost himself. In losing Sancti, he lost himself and everything he had given to Sancti at that point. So that's kind of what leads him down this path of alcoholism, to the point of the beginning of the book. Beginning of the book, he's drinking and driving like he typically does, going getting McDonald's like every broke homeless man does. I don't really think he was homeless. At least I didn't picture him as that. I know he had an apartment. I didn't really think of him having a job because it wasn't important. So that's up to you if you want to make up that fan-made story. I do not care. Have fun with that. Maybe I will in the future. You never know. So, Tim is going to get McDonald's, as every middle-aged man does. And he goes to get McDonald's, and he's going down this road, a little drunk, obviously. I think it was Jack Daniels he chose, which actually would be my alcohol of choice. Nothing against Jack Daniels, nor am I going to drink, but it would be my alcohol of choice. So, he's driving down this road, and another car, who he thought he correctly did the turn sign, or stoplight, I forget what exactly it was, but basically he thought he had turned right, which is a metaphor in itself. He hits his car, and he kills himself. he kills a father and son. And the first chapter is him dying on the pavement. That is how our story begins. From there, face to face with the Reaper is in the afterlife. The entire series takes place in the afterlife until the first and last chapters of the series. Right now, there might be a prequel, but I'm not announcing anything until I actually write it. So, he meets the Reaper. Now, one thing you have to understand is that we are not really talking religion here. It's not about religion. So, the Reaper kind of just represents death. Death, all of that. And I don't like portraying death as a bad person. Rather, both of these characters, the one that takes over God or the Creator, whatever you want to consider it, and the one that takes over death or the Reaper, don't consider them good or bad. If you ever consider one of my characters good or bad, I hate you and you need to reread the novel. That's a joke. But never consider one of my characters good or bad. It is a moral spectrum. They may do something terrible, but they might be a good person. It really depends. Morality isn't a binary. It is very much a spectrum, a blurring gray line that none of us understand. So, the Reaper basically takes him through this entire journey of facing himself, of facing everything he had done. And Tim Shultz goes through the grieving process of realizing he had lost himself, realizing he had lost himself to addiction, and that he had inherently killed himself without actually killing himself until that point. And there is a scene where he almost does. He lets himself almost drown. It is one of my favorite scenes to look back on because I love the creative choices of formatting. I've actually always had fun formatting my books. I do it all myself anyways, but I have a lot of fun doing that. He faces so much in this novel, really, but most of it's facing himself and understanding what he had done to kill that father and son. And there's a lot of important characters, a lot of themes, and I want to say that when talking in this novel, I am not telling you to love yourself. I do not agree with self-love, nor do I agree with self-hatred. What I am presenting here is self-acceptance. It is understanding that you are both a shit and good person, and you must embrace both. And that he had fucked up to this point, and that is why he's dead. So, that's why he's here. Tim Shultz's entire storyline revolves around him finally accepting that he had done wrong. And when he does that, it kind of frees him. So, there's another character, if I can remember their name, that represents his self-hatred later in the novel. Ordent. Fun fact, if you know the chapter, it's actually from a different language. If you know that language, that's where I got the name. Fun fact. Ordent represents his self-hatred later in the novel. There's a couple of symbolism, but he's a big one. In fact, the entire song, Let Them Hate As So Long As They Fear, is actually from Ordent's perspective, not Tim. The rest of it's narrated by Tim. But Ordent represents his self-hatred. All of it. And Ordent says some very fucked up things, but it represents everything that Tim feels towards himself. See, you have to understand, through self-acceptance, he's not learning to love himself, he's learning to accept himself. And in that, he kills his self-hatred, or self-love in a sense. Self-love in a more narcissistic sense. He kills that self-hatred, and he finally relinquishes that control that it had. So, Ordent represents that. Ordent's kind of mocking, he's kind of teasing. He's introduced in chapter 6, and dies later in the book. He's not an important character, so I don't care to give that to you. He dies. And while Tim's going through all of this, he says a lot of different things. There's a lot of motifs. But he really learns what he had done wrong. He really learns why everything went wrong. And it really has to do with how he looked at himself. Because a thing you have to understand about addiction is not inherently just created. It doesn't start. Someone doesn't just do alcohol. Someone doesn't just pick up a drink. Usually it's the emotional and environmental background that kind of leads to the psychological conditions for addiction to form. And that's what happens with Tim Shultz. It's not a loss of control, it's a loss of himself. He had lost himself. There's nothing he can do about that. So, when he's dealing with all of this, and I think there's one chapter where there's kind of like a monster of himself, and multiple monsters of how he sees himself subvertly. He has to come to terms with all of this. Alcoholism wasn't the problem. It was the fact that he had lost himself. Because alcoholism itself is a very deceptive name. Addiction, we often think of the substance, but it's not the substance that leads to addiction. I know that sounds weird. Hear me out. It's the person. It's what and that doesn't mean blame, it means the psychological conditions that lead to it, the things they've been through, the unhealed trauma, the unhealed steps. See, this entire scenario could have probably been avoided if he had just gone to therapy. But like most men, he didn't do that. So that's what leads to alcoholism and his addiction, and his whole psychology and his self-hatred, and the way he looks at himself, the fact that he almost kills himself in the afterlife. He almost lets himself drown. But he comes up with a term that becomes more and more and more important in the second novel. Death is not defeat. Stolen from Architects. I'd say sorry, I'm not. It's a dope-ass quote. So, death is not defeat is a major idea in this first book, but it's not said as much, and that's on purpose. Him losing himself originally through sanctity was not defeat. Never was. It was understanding how he could regrow himself. If you were to use an analogy for how I look at the self, it is like a garden. When you lose a flower, you can plant anew. There's still soil rich. You cannot get rid of the nutrients in that soil. So by losing himself, he didn't really, he had to grieve that too, and he didn't. He turned to alcoholism instead of going to therapy and accepting himself. Now, I'm not a big fan of the mental health system. A lot of books of mine could tell you that. Like A Poem of a Sorry Soul is basically a mental health diss track, if you understand some of the things I write in there. But Tim could have probably solved his problems even just talking to someone, facing himself, looking at that person in the mirror. He doesn't do it. And when he talks to sanctity in the novel, what I'm going to say is that it's up for debate if anything in the novel is actually real. You could just take the beginning and the end and consider the middle maybe some dream that didn't happen. I am not going to say that is how it goes or how that doesn't go. I would like for you to think of that. I would love to hear what people have to say about that. But his entire journey in this novel is really kind of due to himself and kind of having to deal with himself and realize all he had done wrong and all he had done in the alcoholism. I'm not making very much sense in the last sentences. Sorry about that. Everything he had done up to this point, and sanctity being there, is kind of up for debate too. Sanctity, you could say, is talking to him or not. I will leave that up for debate. That is your decision. But sanctity is just kind of a loving, I don't want to say housewife. She's just a very loving woman. Woman? Yeah, apparently she's multiple. Woman. She is a very lovely girl. She is the type of girl that you dream of, but most men can't get because of a lot of reasons, of which I will not talk about here because this novel's not about that. She is his ride and die. She has been there through him for everything. And sanctity loves him. So imagine how that felt in sanctity losing him. So, that's really it. I mean, I could rant on and on. And that's what I'm going to do in the next novel, next video too. But the main ideas really that I want you to take away, the main things I would suggest is if you see someone dealing with addiction, don't look at it as the substance of the bad thing, but what psychological conditions led to it and how you can have someone learn to accept themselves. There's a lot of quotes around self-love where it's like you have to learn to love yourself before anyone else. Fuck that. Fuck that shit. A lot of people aren't going to love themselves. I don't love myself. I don't think that's wrong to say. I accept myself. I am not the greatest or the terriblest person. I am the spectrum. I am the gray line. And that's how I write all my characters too. So, Tim Schultz has to accept that he's the gray line. And that's what kind of gives him that liberation. So, if you walk away from this novel, the lesson I kind of want you to take is learn to accept yourself. You will run into a lot less issues if you just learn that, hey, I'm human. Being human sucks. I have emotion. That's okay. Accept it. Doesn't mean it's good or bad. Just kind of how we are. We're just kind of here. And the huge link between these two novels, how we go from psychology to existentialism. And that's when we're talking about face-to-face with God. Okay, time to walk over there and make someone scared. Ooh.